Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and today I want to tell you guys a very interesting story about a Starship components manufacturer who was basically forced into building a fighter platform. And this was a very uninspired design, but somehow it accidentally became one of the most prolific starfighters of its generation. I guess you could say that this is a tale of the ultimate overachiever. So, in the years leading up to the Clone Wars, the defense industry had remained suppressed without much growth or innovation for almost 1,000 years. The Ruusan Reformation more or less got rid of all federal military spending, and therefore, you didn't have large Starship manufacturing contracts anymore. The existing manufacturers in the galaxy had to rely on much smaller scale planetary defense force or corporate security contracts. Now, if you're lucky, you might be able to contract an entire sector defense force, or maybe one of your platforms is so popular that multiple PDFs will actually deploy them. But, gone was the era of 10,000 credit toilet seats. Without federal military funding, you couldn't build large-scale industrial military firms. The Starship manufacturers that existed before the Ruusan Reformation had to basically shift over to building civilian and commercial products as well, in order to survive. But then a crazy political catalyst occurred overnight that changed the entire industry of Starship manufacturing, and that was the appearance of the Separatist droid army and the Jedi-led clone army. You suddenly had demand for starfighters the galaxy had not seen in 1,000 years. And I can't understate just how big this demand was. There was a general panic in the Grand Army of the Republic in those early days. People watched in horror as more than 200 Jedi died at Petronaki Arena, and then a bunch more ran headfirst at the droid fortifications on Geonosis, leading a bunch of 9-year-old clones waving around that lightsaber in the air, helping enemy artillery walk in their rounds. It was a complete bloodbath, but what people don't realize is the situation could have been a lot worse. A lot of people forget that during the Battle of Geonosis, the clone army was deployed in a fleet of transports, the Acclimator-class assault ship, without any capital ships escorting them. The Vanderer-class Star Destroyer wouldn't see action until many months later at the Battle of Christophsis, so those Acclimators were basically going in naked. I mean, they did have fighter cover, but that came in the form of a test squadron full of prototype V-19 starfighters and the Jedi's own Delta-7 Aethersprite Light interceptors. The clones were lucky that none of those transports got shot down, because if one did, you would lose, 5 to 10% of your entire invasion army. So it's kind of crazy. Now, while Mace Windu and Yoda were rushing to the battlefields of the Clone Wars, basically, Republic military procurement officers were scouring the galaxy for Starship manufacturers. It was a desperate time. While multi-purpose fighters and interceptors like the V-19 and Delta-7 Aethersprite existed because of the security needs of planetary defense forces, there were, however, a severe lack of other types of ships that just weren't very common in the galaxy, like gunships, for instance. The Kaminoans luckily had secretly contracted Quad Systems Engineering, who secretly contracted their own subsidiary, Rathana Heavy Engineering, into making the LAAT multi-purpose platform. But after Geonosis, it became clear that they needed a more protected, faster, and hyperdrive-equipped fighter. Ideally, a ground assault/fighter bomber. Problem was, that wasn't something that you'd normally find in a planetary defense force, and the Republic Judicial Forces kind of frowned upon carpet bombing. There also wasn't that much capital ship versus capital ship duels in the galaxy at the time, so you essentially had a complete vacuum in this one type of ship. I mean, 90% of space combat at the time was between patrol vessels and modified freighters used by pirates. Most of them were probably created by Corellian Engineering Corporation. I mean, they kind of sold to both sides, made a killing. Now, some industrial manufacturers saw the writing on the wall and detected the growing unrest, especially in the Outer Rim territories, in the centuries or so leading up to the Clone Wars. Two of these companies would basically start manufacturing starships, taking advantage of the economic demand, and one of those companies was Incom Corporation. In the decades leading up to the Clone Wars, they had produced a pretty well-received Z-95 Headhunter, and that would basically get them through the door and land them a pretty lucrative multi-purpose starfighter contract, and eventually they would also land the ARC-170 contract as well. The other company that entered the Starship manufacturing industry was Conocer Manufacturing. They were based on the planet of Conocer, a small grand colony. Now, most Starship consumers would have never heard of a company like this, but if you were a shipbuilder, there's actually a good chance that Conocer Manufacturing was one of your vendors. At one point in galactic history, 1 out of every 5 ships basically had a part or a component from Conocer. They were known for building excellent engines, but they also tapped into the weapons, shields, and sensor markets. About 72% of their profit basically came from ship components. They also made the famous K-22995 flight helmet, which was favored by Rebel Alliance pilots during the Galactic Civil War. As a company, Konansera enjoyed staying on the parts and components manufacturing side of the business. Design and sales is a completely different world from understanding how to build factories and engineer cost-efficient and reliable parts. But the Republic was desperate to put more firepower into their starfighter platforms. The V-19 and Delta-class Aether lacked the payload to really do damage against larger Separatist warships, and the Republic Navy, especially in those early years, was completely outgunned and outnumbered. And so, putting proton torpedoes and proton bombs on a small fighter platform was kind of a no-brainer. It was cost-efficient and could be manufactured much quicker than a bunch of capital ships. Also, the Republic Clone Army planetside was getting overwhelmed by the massive, cheaply manufactured droid army. But the only thing that was holding the onslaught back was clever use of combined arms tactics. And now they needed another arm, a flying arm. Ideally a tactical bomber, because those droid armies were getting way too close to clone positions, and that just wasn't something that the Republic could afford to do. You can't have a lot of losses when it takes 9 years to train your soldiers. And so the Republic Navy, without any alternatives, without any Starship manufacturers creating a ship that filled their needs, went directly to Konansera Manufacturing and commissioned a fighter bomber from them. So this was most likely because Konansera Manufacturing already had a lot of ship parts lying around, a lot of engines that were ready to be utilized. The BTL-B Y-Wing was the result of this contract. Built around two Konansera R-200 Ion jets, this 23.4 meter long fighter bomber was massive, especially when compared to the diminutive Separatist droid fighter. I mean, take a look at how big the freaking engine is on this thing compared to a trooper. The Y-Wing was just way too large for its purpose in a lot of ways, especially if you consider the design preferences of the time, but clearly Konansera Manufacturing didn't have the experience or time to build a more efficient model, and so this is basically what the Republic got. Luckily, the Venator-class Star Destroyer could accommodate such a large ship that was basically the size of a gunboat. The Y-Wing was so long that a rear turret position was incorporated into the fighter to protect it from any interceptors that might be trailing it. But here's the thing, the large engines, the large space frame meant that you could hold up to 12 proton torpedoes and 2 launchers, or the equivalent in bombs, and that was a significant amount of firepower. That was more than enough to scrap an entire Separatist fleet or turn an entire droid army on the ground into spare parts.
Good old Oddball. Always on target.
Now, Konansera Manufacturing sacrificed speed and maneuverability not just for firepower, but also for durability. I mean, this ship had a lot of armored plating on it and also had a very strong deflector shield that was powered by a very strong power plant because, again, those engines were so powerful. So everything was kind of upscaled a little bit because this was a very rushed and cobbled together design. I would argue that this was a fluke, a complete fluke, because on paper this thing should not have performed nearly as well as it did. But here's the thing, I mean, the Y-Wing's large, bulky size actually gave it a huge advantage in a strange way, because Clone Wars era dogfighters were smaller and lighter vessels. It was basically all about maneuverability. I mean, take a look at Republic fighters, they're pretty small, but droid fighters were even smaller. I mean, these things didn't have cockpits, life support systems, they were extremely short range. And so while the Y-Wing flew like a flying dump truck, it had more than enough armor to basically absorb any type of punishment that the nimble but lightly armed droid fighters in Separatist fleet could dish out. If Incom had the capacity to manufacture this bomber, they probably would have won the contract, and they would have developed an overcomplicated, expensive platform that would have taken ages to deploy. And if Quad Systems Engineering got this platform, they would have designed like a wedge-shaped fighter, probably, and you wouldn't have as much payload stored on board. And Konansera actually had time and experience to develop a more competitive platform. They probably would have built a sleeker, lighter ship that was less powerful, had less durability and less payload, and it probably would have suffered more losses, and it would not have been nearly as effective as the Y-Wing. Because again, the Republic was fighting a quality versus quantity battle, and so firepower was really the key word. The Y-Wing, despite looking like the supermarket brand of fighters, became extremely beloved by the pilots and also the troops on the ground who witnessed their awe-inspiring bombing runs.
Reinforcements! The reinforcements have arrived!
This was one of the smallest ships in the entire Republic fleet that could carry the electro-proton bomb, and that thing could wipe out an entire droid field army and leave organics in the area unharmed. Ultimately, this clunky vessel became one of the most underrated platforms in the entire Clone Wars. One could argue that without it, the Republic would have never defeated the Separatist Alliance. You could also say the same thing about the Rebellion's victory against the Empire. And here's the thing, a lot of the qualities of the Y-Wing that were considered poor design choices during the Clone Wars actually made it very relevant 2 decades later during the Galactic Civil War. Actually, the new Rebellion faced a very similar situation to the Republic when they were looking for a fighter bomber. At the time, the Rebel Starfighter Corps was primarily made up of small blockade runners and snub fighters, all hyperdrive equipped. They were carrying out hit-and-run attacks against the Empire and needed something that could punch a lot heavier, but still could run away before the Empire countered. The Y-Wing had actually been retired at the end of the Clone Wars. The Empire was going in a different direction, and so a lot of these ships were either donated or just sold to local planetary defense forces, and thousands more were lying in scrapyards waiting for decommissioning. And of course, a great deal were bought by funds given to the rebellion by Bail Organa and Mon Money Mothma, and even more were stolen. Now, the Rebel engineers and mechanics had to modify these BTL-B Y-Wings to such an extent that it basically became its own broke-ass variant called the BTL-A4 Y-Wing. But these adjustments didn't fundamentally change what the Y-Wing was. Instead, they were done to, essentially make it more suitable for the Rebel Alliance's very special needs. For instance, the Rebellion didn't have enough pilots, let alone gunners, to sit in that rear turret, so that was gone. And while they were back there, they chopped off several meters from the back of the ship by removing the engine nacelles, making the ship 25% shorter and a much smaller target for TIE fighters. They also removed a lot of armored panels from the back of the ship where the engine and power plant was. This wasn't just to reduce weight, it was to give engineers and mechanics more access to these engines. Remember, the R200s were basically the same ion jet engines that were used during the Clone Wars, and 20 years later they're starting to show their age, and so they needed constant love and maintenance. I mean, honestly, the Rebel mechanics were the true heroes of the war. And, George Lucas would have been proud of them because he was kind of a hot rodder. So he would have enjoyed the fact that they made a new type of Y-Wing by just modifying it. This thing is basically a hot rod. But yeah, what you ultimately got was a lighter and faster starfighter. It's probably closer to what connoisseur manufacturing would have built had they had a little more time in the design room. But ultimately, that titanium frame and reinforced alloy steel alloy of the original Clone Wars era vessel hadn't aged a second. And while it was overkill during the Clone Wars, where you had a lot of lighter, maybe ships using composite materials, for the Galactic Civil War and its hectic dogfights, the Y-Wing was a lot more survivable and therefore kind of perfect. In many ways, it had surprisingly reached its prime 20 years after it was first launched. The massive payload on board this thing again made it the ideal bomber for the Rebellion. It was far more successful at taking down capital ships than the B-Wing and that fugly Star Fortress thing. That mining rig got more people killed on board than it actually did killing. It's kind of funny if you think about it. No manufacturer ever put so little effort to build a platform that became so successful and long-lived. I feel like if you're a Starship designer or a manufacturer, you're probably shaking your fist at the screen right now, but that's just how the industry works sometimes. Sometimes people get lucky, sometimes random things can happen. I mean, it's almost controversial for me to even say that the Y-Wing was an overachiever or poorly designed, because it's definitely one of the most beloved starships in the galaxy. But if you had read the trade journals at the time, they would have ripped it apart. Which goes to show you, you can only tell so much by reading the spec sheets. I mean, a lot of times you have to let a starship just enter the field and see what it can do. Sometimes they'll surprise you. Kind of like the A-10 Warthog, which was supposed to be retired many years ago, but surprisingly found a nice niche and just adapted to the role it needed to enter. Yeah, the Y-Wing and the A-10 Warthog are basically, they're like spiritual cousins, you know what I mean? But anyway, this is why when I heard Consolidated Connoisseur Manufacturing and Holdings started producing the BTA-NR2 Y-Wing, which essentially is just an updated version of the Rebels' jury-rigged Frankenstein bomber, I went all in and bought a bunch of stock in the company because, nostalgia sells, and, that platform, it just works. It's got decades of testing in the field. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that I am not a fiduciary. I'm a spice runner. See you next time.